There is a very strong belief that the dust from the tomb of St. John, any tiny speck, even the soil from this ground, the dust from the columns, can bring about healing. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Then Jesus, seeing his mother standing there and the disciple whom he loved, said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his home. What does the gospel tell us about Jesus' concern for the future of his mother? It's fundamental to understand the journey we're about to take now. Through time and the ancient city of Ephesus in what was once Asia Minor and what is now Turkey. Today's special is for us to thoroughly investigate the story of the Apostle John. The first question we have to ask is, who was the beloved disciple who appears in the Gospel of John? And even more, was there really a beloved disciple? Or is this just a very particular view of the author of the Gospel of John? Why does only one gospel say this, and it's just a detail in the text? Actually, we notice that he does not mention the name of the most beloved disciple. Why would the author of the Gospel of John omit the name of the disciple if he was the most beloved by Jesus? Wouldn't you expect him to say, such and such apostle, the most beloved by Jesus? His most beloved disciple, John, Peter, Bartholomew, Magdalene. And right at the moment of the crucifixion, did the author of the gospel really not want to specify who the beloved disciple was? Did he want any apostle to somehow fit that description? So, as with many other mysteries, tradition here took it upon itself to fill in the gaps, wanting to finally define who that beloved disciple was. And the verdict began to be written by one of the greatest Christian theorists of the period that followed the end of the apostles' lives. In the 2nd century, when Christianity was still being formed, Irenaeus of Lyon, the bishop, wrote a massive treatise combating the so-called heresies and practically defining what Catholic orthodoxy was. He implied that the beloved disciple who was at the foot of the cross was John, the son of Zebedee. But why couldn't it have been Peter, the apostle closest to Jesus throughout his journey? And in fact, it was Peter who sheltered Jesus in his house in Capernaum. There is a very current line of research that says the beloved disciple was James, the one who is presented to us in the Gospels as the brother of Jesus. Does that make sense? Of course, James was very close to Jesus. However, he will be the one responsible for taking over the congregation immediately after the crucifixion. Historical research shows us, and there are many documents proving this, including apocryphal texts that have already been used by the church. Research shows us that practically the day after the crucifixion, James will take command of the congregation of the followers of Jesus. He is the one who will lead the flock. So would it make sense for a political leader who knows he will have an important mission to risk being arrested at the moment of Jesus' crucifixion? Is there any mention of James being present at the cross? Do any of the Gospels talk about this? Or about any other man, for that matter? Why James? The one who is going to take over the congregation the next day would put himself in danger, risking the entire mission of Jesus. It's very unlikely. And finally, there's still another possibility, Lazarus. It makes a lot of sense to think that Jesus and Lazarus were close, very close at that moment. It had only been a few days since Jesus had visited Lazarus' tomb, and the story tells us that Lazarus was resurrected there. In other words, the two were already friends. A great miracle attributed to Jesus had just happened, and of course, Jesus and Lazarus would be very close at that moment. More than that, Lazarus had a house, he had a family, he could very well take Mary in. Now, we can't forget that the resurrection of Lazarus bothered the Jews who ran the temple at that time so much, it bothered the Pharisees that Lazarus had been marked for death. Would he show up at the crucifixion of Jesus at such a tense moment? It's very unlikely. Why couldn't Mary Magdalene be the beloved disciple? Because she was a woman? Why not? Apocryphal texts, canonical texts, many texts show us the closeness of Magdalene to Jesus, and it is the Gospel of John itself that tells us that Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection. Why not Magdalene? Let me reread the passage from the Gospel, just changing a few words. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Then Jesus, seeing his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing there, said to his mother. And it would make a lot of sense to think that the author of the Gospel did not mention the name of the beloved disciple because he had just referred to this disciple who would be Mary Magdalene. It's a hypothesis. It will always be a hypothesis. We won't be sure, but the evidence is there. We can follow whatever path we want, or follow the path of tradition that says the beloved disciple was John. And the question keeps echoing here through the ruins and mountains of Ephesus. Why John? We can speculate, but we'll never be sure. Tradition says it's because he was among the first to follow Jesus, witnessed the miraculous catch of fish, and is mentioned at key moments in the Master's life. Irenaeus of Lyon wrote, "Then John, the disciple of the Lord, the one who also rested on his chest, published the gospel while living in Ephesus in Asia." When saying that John rested on Jesus' chest, Irenaeus is not saying that he is the beloved disciple, but rather that he was a beloved disciple. What Irenaeus does, in fact, is to say that John the Apostle is the same as John the Evangelist. And we'll see that later on. But Irenaeus was just the first to address this topic, which later evolved into the idea that John the Apostle was the most beloved disciple. A century later, around the year 300, the bishop and historian Eusebius of Caesarea reaffirmed that the Apostle John was the author of the Gospel, that he lived in Ephesus, and wrote both the Gospel and the letters attributed to him. At this time, the same one whom Jesus loved, the Apostle and Evangelist John, was still living in Asia Minor. The book of Revelation, which is attributed to the same author as the Gospel of John, makes an important reference to Ephesus. Already in the second chapter, in what would be a message from Jesus to the churches of that region, which at the time was known as Asia Minor. And according to what the book of Revelation says, Jesus would be satisfied with the way the Christians here were dealing with the so-called false apostles. Write to the angel of the church in Ephesus. This is what he who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands, says, I know your works, your labor, and your patience, and that you cannot tolerate evil. And you have tested those who say they are apostles and are not, and you found them to be liars. You have endured, you have patience, and you have worked for my name and have not grown weary. John was the son of Zebedee, brother of James, who because of his age became known as James the Greater. John and James were part of what is presented to us as the group of the 12 original apostles of Jesus. He appears very young next to the Master in representations of the Last Supper, which were made long after the comments of Irenaeus and Eusebius. And according to this interpretation, he would have been the only apostle who witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus. But is that really the case, huh? Doesn't it make more sense to think that Just like the other apostles, John had to hide so he wouldn't be arrested, tortured, and killed by the Romans, just like what had just happened to the Master. We don't hear anything about the other apostles at the crucifixion, and even this beloved disciple isn't mentioned by name. Or better yet, doesn't it make sense to think, following John's own gospel, that it was the three Marys who were there at the moment of the crucifixion, and that one of them would be the beloved disciple? Well, in that case, the beloved disciple would be Mary Magdalene. At that significant moment I mentioned at the beginning, in chapter 19, the Gospel of John states that Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to the beloved disciple. From up on the cross, Jesus said that. And tradition, as I have also said, determined that the beloved disciple was the Apostle John. But there was never any solid proof of that. What we know, considering everything that happened afterward with all the persecution, is that John came here to Ephesus. He came to preach in one of the largest cities of the Roman Empire, and that made perfect sense. Now, tradition also tells us that John came with Mary. About John's coming here, we have a very strong and important historical piece of information. Back in the 2nd century, Bishop Polycarp of Ephesus wrote a letter to Pope Victor over in the Vatican, informing him about the existence of a tomb of St. John here. John is said to have lived a long life. Some say more than 90, maybe even 100 years, we're not sure. What seems certain is that he was the apostle who lived the longest and the only one who was not martyred. That John was still alive at this time is confirmed by 2 witnesses. And these witnesses, representatives of the orthodoxy of the Church, are quite trustworthy, being men like Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. The Basilica of St. John in Ephesus was built in the 6th century during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, one of the most Christian rulers in history. This was around the year 548 AD. The basilica was built where tradition said the tomb of John was located. This is one of the most sacred places here in Ephesus for Christians. Maybe I can say that it is the most historic because we have very ancient references to the existence of a tomb of St. John here in this region where the basilica was built. The sign says San John in Mezere, which in Turkish means the tomb of St. John. We can't say for sure that this was the exact place. It's possible that a symbolic place was chosen in the center of the basilica. But we do have historical information that as early as the 3rd century, there was indeed a tomb of St. John here, a tomb of the Apostle John. The tomb of St. John was first in a small church, already in the time of Constantine, then in a huge basilica, and today in the ruins of that basilica. There is no other place nor any other apostle that has left behind a tomb with such clear, well-documented historical evidence. There is a strong belief that the dust from the tomb of St. John, any tiny crumb, even the earth from this ground, the dust from the columns, can work cures. Because it connects us directly with St. John. So a lot of people come here wanting to touch these columns, touch the marble, to take even a little bit of this dust home. Thinking about healing themselves. My request is for a spiritual healing in the best sense. Peace of mind. Peace of mind. For all of us. So, are you enjoying this video? So let me invite you. Come study with me in the course The History of the Mother of Jesus. It's an immersive course with 15 lessons and more than 7 hours of learning. We start with the birth of Mary, follow her up to the moment of her death, and then embark on a 2,000-year journey through religious debate and the spread of devotion to Our Lady. If you want to start studying with me right now, go to rodrigoalvarez.site, or to make it easier, just click the link below in the video description. Oh, and I almost forgot, we visit more than 20 sacred places from Paris to Jerusalem. The link is here in the description. Just click there and I'll be waiting for you in the classroom. Let's get back to watching our video now. It's amazing to think that all of this was underground for centuries and centuries. It was only recently in the 20th century, during a period when Greece took control of this region in the long battle between Greeks and Turks between 1926 and 1928. The archaeologists excavated all of this, unearthed all these stones and columns, and they were only satisfied when they found what they believed to be the tomb of St. John. The one I just showed you, this place so sacred to Christians today and to those in the past as well. Now, as for the remains, the bones of St. John, nothing, absolutely nothing was found. Now, let's learn some historical details and interesting facts about the construction of the Basilica of St. John. We are going to talk to Emre Ardek, a very experienced tour guide here in Turkey, who has the great advantage of also speaking Portuguese because he lived in Brazil for a while. Thank you very much, Emre, for showing us Ephesus and this impressive basilica.
My pleasure. Welcome to my country.
Emre, tell me a little about the construction of the basilica.
Here at the Basilica of St. John, we will see some details, such as, for example, the architecture. Byzantine architecture. So there may be a lot of influence from the architecture of Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene.
The two churches in Istanbul.
Those two churches in Istanbul had the same features, and you can still see the same thing here in the materials, the style, and the columns.
For example, these columns.
These columns, for example, that we see here are originally from the region, but a lot of material from the Basilica of St. John was reused.
From where?
From the Temple of Artemis.
The temple of the goddess Artemis, the pagan goddess.
Yes.
Yes. Did the same columns come to the basilica?
It was already in ruins. It had already lost its importance because the religion there had changed from paganism to Christianity. So the Temple of Artemis had no importance. They used those same stones and marbles here in the new construction.
It's interesting to think that St. Paul, who was almost imprisoned, there's even a tradition that says he was imprisoned. He faced the crowd because of the goddess Artemis. Imagine that later, the columns and stones from the Temple of Artemis would end up in a Christian basilica. Yes.
It's a story like that all over Turkey, a whole mix of different cultures and different religions. Since we're at the Basilica of St. John today, this was once the first Ephesus, the Roman city.
The ancient city.
Ancient before the Romans in the Hittite period. According to the people of Ephesus, there was a tomb of St. John here from the very beginning, since the time when St. John died here in Ephesus. And later, a chapel was built here, we can say, during the time of Constantine. And under Theodosius, during the time of Theodosius, a larger church was built, and Justinian, at the same time as the construction of Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene, a very large basilica was built here.
What was here?
This was a baptismal room in the Basilica of St. John. And in the region we can see many baptismal pools of the same type.
It's interesting that it's a baptism by immersion.
Yes, in the Orthodox churches and also in the first centuries of Christianity, that size of baptismal pool is normal because it wasn't just children being baptized, it was adults too.
Who converted?
Yes, and they would enter this large pool, or you could even say huge, compared to today's baptismal pools.
It's interesting first because it reminds us of John the Baptist, baptism by immersion, the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan River. Jesus enters the water to be baptized.
Exactly.
The pools in Jerusalem where all the Jews would enter, the mikvahs, were all like this as well, with a place to enter by a staircase. You would cleanse yourself in some cases with the understanding that it was also a spiritual cleansing, as with the Essenes, and you would come out of the pool renewed. So it's interesting to understand that up until the 6th century, we still have a preserved Jewish ritual here.
It's important, it's true, yes.
And these stones here, some we can see are new, there's new concrete, but there are stones from that time. There are stones.
There's marble. You can see the color, the pattern of the marble. Some are original, but we can imagine that this area remained open to the air for many centuries. And to protect the floor, they used a lot of new marble and also concrete.
How was this place destroyed? What happened that made this ceiling suddenly collapse here? Or was it not sudden?
It wasn't sudden. It happened over a very long period when Ephesus, as a city, lost its importance, and there was not much population here anymore. The population moved to Smyrna, or in Turkish, Izmir, and that's why these places, after losing their importance, started to decline when they are not well taken care of.
Was this amphora here since the time of the Byzantines?
Yes, that's true.
Que ela era usada para fazer vinho?
Vinho, com certeza, nas igrejas. Guardar. To ferment wine, but it has another important part of the local economy here in the region, which is still important in Turkey today, is olive farming. We have 200 million olive trees. Agriculture was important, and in this Aegean region, olive oil, as it has been throughout history, is still very important.
So they would have stored olive oil here for consumption and for lighting.
For consumption and for trade with different parts of the Mediterranean at that time.
Now, Emre, why is there an amphora inside the basilica?
Because they had daily needs as well. Because they had a life here, as we can imagine, much like in a monastery. There were people living here. They needed to eat, prepare food, and everything else. That's why there were olive trees here.
I'm always reflecting on everything we talk about during our specials. Today I decided to stop here to have some Turkish coffee, to be able to digest things more and talk a bit more about what needs to be said. Coffee is also part of being here in this region, present-day Turkey. Coffee didn't exist like this in Jesus' time. Nobody drank coffee. They had other drinks, but not coffee. Coffee really started later. It was around the 9th century in Ethiopia, and then it evolved. Here in Constantinople, which later became Istanbul, it eventually turned into the drink we know today. So we're in a place on earth where coffee took on the form we know. And what's interesting is that this is the traditional method. It's heated, warmed up here in the sand. The little bronze pot usually stays in contact with this sand, and the coffee heats up. It takes just a little more than 2 or 3 minutes for it to be ready when the pot is hot. There's a heater underneath here, right? And there's no coffee better than Turkish coffee. Honestly, I've tried coffee all over the world. I love our Brazilian coffee, but this one here is what I would call original coffee, classic coffee. The great coffee of the world is Turkish coffee. It's coffee. This coffee is such a wonderful thing. Truly unique. Unique, truly unique. It's a privilege to have this coffee here after reflecting so much on the story of Apostle John, of what it once was. Greece, then it became the Ottoman Empire. Byzantine first, then Ottoman, and today it's Turkey. With all this coffee tradition that really took hold here. There is no coffee in the world that can be compared to this one. Believe what I'm telling you. If you haven't come to Turkey, if you can come one day and try this coffee, you'll understand what I'm talking about. I've also talked about this passage here with you. At that time, the same person whom Jesus loved, the apostle and evangelist John, was still living in Asia Minor. And there he continued leading the churches after returning from exile on the island of Patmos. The island of Patmos is a Greek island that is nearby. And where does the evangelist, the author of the gospel, come from? It is almost a consensus among scholars today that the author of the gospel is John of Patmos, who lived near here on a Greek island. Then we have Clement of Alexandria saying John moved from the island of Patmos to Ephesus. From here he used to leave when called even to the neighboring pagan regions, with the purpose of in some places establishing bishops, in others establishing whole churches, and in others still ordaining some of those who had been appointed by the Holy Spirit. What can we say? Historically, we know that early on in Irenaeus, the union of the two historical figures emerged, John the Evangelist and John the Apostle. When they say back then that there is a John buried here, when there is a message from Ephesus to Pope Victor saying that there is a John buried here, they are talking about John the Apostle. But we know that at that moment there is already a mix between the two, John the Evangelist and John of Patmos. Are they the same person after all? Was there only one John? Or are there two, the evangelist and the apostle? More recent research and contemporary scholars understand that there were two, John of Patmos and John the Apostle, because the text is later, possibly written in the year 120. It's hard to believe John lived that long. He could have. That's why many people say he lived up to 100 years. What is the historical truth? We're not sure. It could be the same John. It could be the apostle who's buried here. It could be John the Evangelist who's buried here in Ephesus. Maybe they're the same person. I'm going to have my coffee here and say goodbye to you because our journey continues.